The document I have placed right now is a mortgagor certification acknowledging a non-borrowing spouse or an unmarried borrower. Now, I know much of society has changed over the years. It used to be if you had a house, chances are pretty high that you were married to everybody living in it. That no longer is the case. Perhaps you chose not to get married because you want to have your children inherit things and you don't want to complicate it with another spouse and you're living with someone. Perhaps you are married but your spouse doesn't own the property. It was you and your previous spouse's property, or you owned it before you ever got married and it's separate marital property. You have to decide before you take this loan, what's going to happen at the end of the life of the loan? Is your spouse or is the person that you're living with going to be able to stay in the house for the rest of their life, or are they going to leave? This can be an important consideration. It can also be a consideration when you have a spouse that's much younger than you are. I have dealt with reverse mortgage counseling for a family where the person taking the reverse mortgage was in his mid-60s. His spouse was in her 30s. Things happen. It's no longer quite the exact same things that happened when all of us were children. So I always tell people, you never know what you're going to be talking about or who you're going to be talking with. When it comes to a non-borrowing spouse, you have to plan ahead. Now, the way a non-borrowing spouse would work, well, first of an unmarried borrower, is you're certifying that you're not married, that no one else is legally allowed to have a portion of the residence, and you're making that certification right away. If it turns out that that certification is wrong, that may mean whoever's living in your house may not be allowed to stay. This can be, again, an important consideration for what you want to have happen. Further, if somewhere down the line that you marry after you take the reverse mortgage out, your new spouse may not be allowed to live in the house for the rest of their life. This is an extremely important thing that you have to plan ahead. Now, if you're married to a non-borrowing spouse, either they don't have a portion of the house that they own, you may have been separated for the last 15 or 20 years but never got around to getting a divorce. You may have a situation for what we call a non-borrowing spouse. Now, I will tell you right now as a counselor, I always encourage people to get that non-borrowing spouse to come in and sit down with the counseling session. The reason I encourage that to happen is because then you have one counseling session, you paid one time, and you're done. This is not something that you want to be thinking about over time and saying, do I have to keep doing this or not? The other thing I will tell you when it comes to a non-borrowing spouse, they may or may not have rights to stay. These are some of the things that you need to think about. If you want them to have a right to stay and they're going to be living in the property the rest of their life, you're not going to get as much money out of this. And the reason you aren't is because if your spouse is 30 and you're 60 something, they're going to live a lot longer than you are. At least that's the presumption. So they're not going to give you access to as much money because they've got to keep the interest still there for that spouse. So that when the house gets sold, they're not relying entirely on the mortgage insurance. However, you don't necessarily want to take a spouse off to try to get more money, because if you do that again, you could force your spouse to lose their benefits. And if you were a non-borrowing spouse, I would highly encourage you not to come off the deed to get this mortgage. Even if they're getting less money, that means you still have some protections. You have no protections whatsoever as a non-borrowing spouse if you're off the deed and you've signed off that they can just toss you out when the time comes. You want to prepare and, again, plan ahead. It's a future thing for everybody there. Now, as a HECM counselor, I've also counseled divorce clients. People in the midst of a divorce using a reverse mortgage to basically buy the other spouse out. I know you, at that point, may not entirely be pleased with the spouse that you're divorcing. You may want to sit together in the same counseling session to save money. Please, please be polite to the counselor. The counselor doesn't care what happened 30 years ago in your marriage and probably doesn't want to hear about it. On the flip side, if you don't think you can be polite, plan on paying for 2 sessions. It is going to be a requirement. I would also tell you, if you're the one being bought out, this is one of those situations you're going to have to go to the counseling or this isn't going to happen. Please try not to be vindictive about it. Try to let the system go through so that you can get your money and move on. No matter how much you want to make sure that the other person suffers, the person that's really suffering is you. Take it and move on as fast as you can. Now, non-borrowing spouses, at the end of the life of the spouse who is the borrowing spouse, you're going to have to let the borrower know, and you're going to have to try to opt in to make sure that you get covered. I know I'm telling you right now, at one of the worst times of your life, you've got to think practically, but you do. I'm going to recommend that when you know your spouse has died, you contact a local HUD housing counseling agency and tell them you have a reverse mortgage and ask for help. If that counseling agency doesn't handle reverse mortgages, ask them to refer you to one who does. The requirement among housing counseling agencies is a housing counseling agency must take a referral from someone if they handle it, and the housing counseling agency referring it does not. HUD wants to make sure that you get the help. This is a time you need it. Make sure you get that help.